gràcies per continuar amb les jornades aquí, amb aquesta aula capella.
At this aula capella of the University of Barcelona. And thank you very much, Géraldine, for being here with us. As you know, Sílvia Marimon, writer, journalist, colleague, will establish some dialogue and presentation about this uncertainty and times that we're going through of our current Europe. So without further ado, since Professor George Mink started this morning and he has spoken about the amnesty of the European memory and the Spanish memory, now she was very well known and she threw light on another type of amnestic amnesty that she placed where she placed the focus. So without further ado, I give the floor to Géraldine. Thank you very much for being here, and you have the floor. Okay, so welcome, and thank you very much for staying with us. I interviewed Géraldine back in 2019 because of what Jordi was explaining. The amnesic was translated into 12 languages and won the European Book Prize. I was very impacted because I had carried out other interviews and I had been reading about victims and also about perpetrators. But it's not so often that we read about people that we could call ordinary people and anonymous citizens who can also have some responsibility of what happened in Germany. I don't know if you have read the book, and Géraldine reminds us that everybody could be responsible for the perpetration of these crimes. She speaks about this and how indifference of the German society made possible Nazism in a way. The grandmother was seduced by Hitler, and the grandfather took advantage of the opportunity to buy a Jewish company, and they were not heroes or victims, and what has been described as monsters in a wrong perspective, so it's easier to identify them. And Géraldine, who is a journalist and also director of documentaries, has published a book, Where Do We Come From? What Unites Us? What Divides Us? In French, and it will be published in German, and in Spain it will be published with Tusquets next year. In a way, this book speaks about the history of Europe, looking for what we have in common and what we can share. As I was saying, that I'm quite surprised at the way she speaks about individual responsibilities, and now that's very important. Not individual responsibility as a load, but in a way as some empowerment tool. So it does not reside in the hands of others, but also in our hands.
I would like to ask you whether we need to think about new forms of narratives when we talk about memory. Some people, and now there are some works, that they see some parallels between nowadays and the German of the 30s, when Hitler came to power. I don't know if you see these parallels, and also how can we build a new narrative? How can we face this kind of a society that we live? That it seems that the memories, the narrative has to change because it doesn't work anymore.
So maybe I start with reading my...
Okay, yes,
because it does answer part of your questions.
Okay.
And then we can discuss on the basis of the text. Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be in Barcelona, in this beautiful building, and what I think to be a chapel, which is, we will see later, also connected to one of the themes of this presentation. So my presentation is called Rethinking Memory Work and the European Narrative. Does the microphone work? Yes? No, okay, I thought also. Hello? Yes? No? No? Or maybe I...
Si no agafa el... A mi sí que em sent, ara se'm sent a mi.
Does it work now? Yes? No, her. Yeah, yeah, but mine is not
Do
working.
you want?
Yeah. Yes? Now? Does it work? Are you sure? Yes? Yes? Okay. Okay. We're there. So, a month ago, I was, maybe without the glasses, I'm still not sure. A month ago, I was at the European Forum in Bled, which is a little city in Slovenia, and I took part in a panel discussion in front of several hundred young Europeans. They were asked a simple but powerful question: are you ready to fight for democracy? Fight in the sense of taking arms. It turned out to be quite a reality check. Not because I expected young people to be eager to die on the front line against warlike powers, implicitly Putin's Russia, but it was a reality check because I sensed something more disturbing: interest in democracy itself. Many of these young people felt that democracy was too weak a cause to fight for. They argued that even within their democratic countries, they didn't feel really that they had a choice. A fellow panelist, a member of the European Council, began a kind of mea culpa, listing the many shortcomings of the EU and our political systems, which he said failed to give young people enough of a say. And while I agreed that these shortcomings must be acknowledged, I also warned: it is dangerous to paint only a dark picture of our societies, because that's exactly what the enemies of democracy want. We must also keep reminding ourselves and others of Europe's extraordinary achievements since 1945 and 1989. And yet, I was shaken. Why did these achievements seem so invisible to these young people? How did we reach the point where we need to sell democracy, as if its benefits were not self-evident? Every day, these young people and their families enjoy the freedoms and security guaranteed by the rule of law and by peace within the EU borders. Yes, Europe has its contradictions. For instance, it is often accused of betraying its values by barricading itself against migrants. But despite its flaws, Europe remains one of the world's most advanced models of fundamental rights protection. That's why so many people still risk their lives to come here. Facing those young people, I couldn't help but think, have they forgotten what came before? A Europe torn apart by wars, nationalism, dictatorships, and destructive ideologies? Or do they simply not realize what it actually means, in very concrete terms, to lose freedom, peace, and democracy? For my generation, and for my parents' generation, the memory of the shared traumas of the 20th century served as a moral compass. It helped anchoring democratic values deeply in our societies. This was especially true in my father's homeland, Germany, where democracy was built through remembrance. The two, democracy and memory work, being inseparable. But today, this moral and educational power of remembrance has faded, partly because this past feels more distant and witnesses are disappearing, so that younger generations struggle to identify with it. But also among older generations, there is fatigue, a kind of memory weariness. And this is dangerous because it makes us more vulnerable to populism, manipulation, and extremism. So what we can do? I would like to suggest two possible paths. First path, which many in Europe are probably already exploring, rethink the way we approach the memory of the 20th century. Conveying this past through moralizing messages filled with guilt and fear and victimization often backfire. What we urgently need is a pragmatic approach, one that helps people use the past as a toolbox, sorry for the historians, to recognize recurring patterns and mechanisms and resist them. History never repeats itself exactly, but the ideologies, the manipulation strategies, and the social psychological mechanisms that a century ago led entire societies into the abyss are re-emerging today. The current idea of a world ruled by the strongest and hierarchies among human beings is not new, nor is the use of lies, historical revisionism, and the delegitimization of science and knowledge. Such techniques were used under totalitarian regimes to create confusion, strip people of their moral compass, and prevent independent thinking. And the same socio-psychological forces, opportunism, conformity, fear, denial, that once made large parts of European societies complicit with criminal regimes, are again at work today in both the United States and Europe, even among those who think they are immune. That's why understanding these recurring mechanisms is essential. The Third Reich, perhaps the most radical example of totalitarian seduction, offers crucial lessons to help us decipher what is happening today. What made Nazism so popular was not only its brutality, but its ability to tap into deep human instincts and desires. The need to belong, the fear of exclusion, the fascination with strength, the desire for superiority, and the temptation of opportunism and conformity. Within just 12 years, the Nazis managed to corrupt the moral compass of an entire nation. They imposed a new value system that glorified domination and dismissed empathy as weakness. Unfortunately, this idea that empathy is a weakness is once again gaining ground. If European memory work placed more emphasis on these aspects, it could maybe sharpen our collective vigilance, not only against ideological and political manipulation, but also against our own human weaknesses. By focusing a bit more on the role of the people, ordinary citizens, played in the rise of the dictatorships in the 20th century out of opportunism, denial, conformism, we could help people understand the mechanisms that make us all vulnerable to authoritarianism. We could help realize that everybody has an influence, for good or for ill. And that's an empowering message. We are not powerless. This approach could provide new insights into how we can resist the systems of ideological and psychological control that are currently being developed in Europe and the United States. As the German philosopher Theodor Adorno reminded us, the best defense against fascism begins with forging one's own character. This means relearning to think for ourselves, cultivating a strong moral compass, and acting according to conscience, rather than bowing to social, partisan, or professional pressure. It means refusing to be intimidated, disoriented, bought, or demoralized. And it means building alliances across the democratic spectrum, left and right, against the extremes. So to sum up this first line of thought, we need to rethink the way we deal with the traumas of the 20th century in order to highlight the socio-political and human mechanisms at work a century ago that are once again relevant today. But, and this is the second part I suggest, we also need a collective ideal. Mobilizing against danger is not enough if it isn't driven by a shared dream. And that dream could be Europe itself. The vision of a continent that turned its back on centuries of violence to become a haven of freedom, culture, and peace. True, the European project still faces many challenges, but it has fulfilled many of its promises, and it continues to inspire people in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and beyond. The paradox is that inside the EU, enthusiasm is fading, to the point where it sometimes fuels the opposite of what it is supposed to serve: nationalism. The narrative of a Europe torn apart by wars and then reconciled no longer unites as it once did. The old promise of never again has lost its emotional power. Perhaps it's time to look further back, to rediscover the deeper roots of Europe, where one can draw a sense of collective consciousness, inspiration, and guidance to navigate a present marked by a loss of bearings. Europe is not just a post-war peace project, a preventive measure against the repetition of the 20th century's violence. It is a civilization shaped over millennia by constant exchanges, migrations, and shared ideas. Borders shifted, cultures intertwined, and waves of people carried with them knowledge, languages, beliefs, and art. Most of Europe's great transformations were the result of long, collective evolutions that crossed frontiers. And yet, in most European countries, the national frame continues to dominate the perception of the past. In the media, education, political speeches, memorials, and museums, we urgently need to tell our story differently, in a more global, interdisciplinary, and supranational way. Beside that, Democrats and liberals have long avoided the question of Europe's identity, fearing it might sound exclusionary or overly simplistic. The problem is that we have left things very vague when citizens need a narrative to guide them. It is difficult to make people love a Europe that cannot be defined. By leaving that space empty, they've allowed others, nationalists and extremists, to fill it with narrow nationalist narratives. So we need a counter-narrative, maybe by trying to trace a common European history that shows how our cultures have been shaped and intertwined over the centuries, how common sources have shaped and continues to shape our way of living, our social and moral norms, our institutions, mentalities, and practices. One of these foundations I would like to highlight is Christian humanism, which is often denied in the name of a misunderstood secularism. Ignoring these Christian roots only leaves them vulnerable to distortion. Whether we are believers or not, we have much to gain by upholding the universal principles of Christianity: human dignity, protection of the weak, forgiveness, social justice. Firstly, because Christian fundamentals remain a moral compass for many in Europe. And secondly, because it is urgent to denounce the hypocrisy of those in Europe and in the United States who claim to follow Jesus while trampling on the essence of his message. Europe's resistance to the forces that threaten it from within and without, will of course also take place on military, technological and economic fronts. But its strength will ultimately depend on the will of Europeans to remain united. As voters, as taxpayers, as consumers, and maybe even soldiers, each of us has the power to tip the scales in favor of a strong Europe. But to unleash this collective European consciousness, we need more than institutions, conferences, and symbols. We need a unifying and inspiring story, a European narrative, because since the dawn of humanity, it is stories that bind people together. Thank you.
Has parlat, entre altres coses,
And among other things, about the fact that we have to speak by ourselves.
said that we have to think for ourselves, to not be manipulated like happened in Germany in the 30s. But it's quite complicated nowadays. I'm, for example, very worried about new generations with the young people, because a lot of them, they learn and they read by social media, and social media is owned by big corporations, and you see a lot of narrative from the extreme right in the social media. So I don't know how you think that we have to approach these younger generations, that maybe they don't go so often to conference, that maybe they don't read newspapers. I don't know, because we have some statistics, and maybe these young voters are the ones who are now voting the extreme right. So how can we approach to these younger people?
I think that, as we know, young people are a bit more radical than older people. They like the idea of fighting for a cause. And I think that instead of backing down on values, on human rights, on dignity, on justice, also on memory work, we should do exactly the contrary and be much more assertive, much more clear about defending this value. And what we see right now is exactly the contrary. We are backing, we are not assertive enough. We try to follow the spirit of these times, which is anti-wokeism, I would name it like this. Mm-hmm. And instead of that, we should be actually much more radical and radically defending these positions. I think only with a clear message you also reach people. Then, of course, even if it's sometimes difficult to be a bit simplistic, we cannot fight against the power of toxic messages with moral superiority, or with knowledge. We need more emotional speeches. We should not be frightened to be too kitsch or too romantic. For example, recently I listened again to Winston Churchill's speech at the beginning of the Second World War, where he convinced the Parliament, he tries to convince the Parliament and the British people to go to war against Hitler, even if Great Britain at that time didn't have to go to war against Hitler. And this is a very, extremely romantic speech, which brought tears to my eyes. So I think public figures should not hesitate to have that kind of tone in order to mobilize the people on an emotional level. And then also on the citizens level, I think we should just speak up every time we can. Speak up in your families, on the streets, at work, with friends, when you meet somebody who is developing ideas which could push him towards the far right, for example. Use every opportunity you have to speak up. Of course, it is not easy because that means conflict. And you can think that it's a drop in the ocean, but I don't think so. I think if everybody speaks up, it has an effect in the end. I'll just give you an example with my mother. My mother is French, she lives in the Paris suburb, and she has some friends who are developing quite far ideas, quite close to far right, and they are sending these conspiracy theories messages through emails. And so she kept sending me these horrible messages, and I thought, what do I do? She's almost 80. Shall I just leave it? And I decided to react. Every time I reacted. And I think that in the end, my mother today, she would never vote for the far right. So it's just one example among many. But we have, of course, an influence on many people. That doesn't mean that we have to manipulate them, but just kind of wake them up, make them understand what they can lose if they vote for such a party. And then, of course, the social networks. The social networks, democratic parties, unfortunately, were very slow to react. So they are, I see in Germany, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, compared to the AfD, the far-right parties, they have, you know, maybe, I don't know, 500,000 followers on Facebook, and AfD has 4 million. So we have actually exactly the same tools, and these tools are open for everybody, so we should be able to use these tools also in our advantage. And one field especially is not occupied enough by democratic forces, it's the podcast. Mm-hmm. And the podcast is something which we're totally underestimated, because it is very powerful and very influential. And nowadays, this is also much more occupied by the far right than by democratic forces. And recently, I tried to find somebody in Brussels, in the EU, to support a podcast project I have. I didn't find anybody. They didn't even know what is a podcast, you know?
Also, you said that we have to give more value to democracy. Maybe I think that now it's changing in Spain, but few years ago, it was like democracy after Franco. It was present from our leaders, from the political parties. Now it's changing a lot. We see that were the citizens who gained that democracy. So maybe we should talk about democracy in other ways. It's not a present that some leader gives to you, and it says, okay, no, don't worry, nobody's going to steal that, because we are seeing that we are losing some rights. We see that in the United States of America. Yeah. So how can we explain democracy? Why it's so important? I mean, we don't have the best democracy, but it's better than any kind of authoritarianism.
I think we have arrived to a time where, for the sake of democracy, we have to make boundaries, and one boundary is against intolerance. And we have to choose to be much more assertive. And it comes at times where we have to take side. And it's very difficult because we're all taught that there is always a space for discussion, for exchange, for compromise. But there is a point where a political party is not anymore part of the democratic discussion. It's not a legitimate adversary anymore, it's an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's suicide out of tolerance. And so I think now the time has arrived. Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre also had a lot of thought about when it is time to take side, also for an intellectual. To take side, it's not between left or right, but it is between democracy against tyranny, truth against lies, freedom against oppression. So I think we have come to the time where one has to take side, and this is the way today we should teach democracy. It's not anymore a space where every voices are welcome. It is to be able to decipher what can destroy democracy from inside, because today dictatorships are not erased, are not established through a military coup. It is established through elections. It was, I mean, in the past, under the Weimar Republic in the 20s, in Germany, also the party of Adolf Hitler gained power through the vote, through elections. And so nowadays, democracies are being destroyed from inside, and so we have to be very clear about what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate, so being more assertive. But beside that, of course, we have to improve our democracies. We have to improve our democracies because they have been very much they are suffering very much from the polarization of the debates in the last years. And we have to teach that democracy is not only about having good laws and a good constitution. It is about unwritten rules. And these unwritten rules is listening to the other, being able to compromise, don't polarize, respect your adversary who was elected. Only, of course, if he doesn't belong to political parties who want to destroy democracy. So I think we need to go these two paths parallelly.
Do you think also that in this new narrative we need also some kind of heroism? I don't know, maybe not. In a way that maybe we should talk more about people who fought for this democracy or who are fighting for this democracy. In a way to say that it's not true that you can not do anything about it because you have no power to do it, but in a way to have examples that demonstrates that you can do something. And in the past, were a lot of people who fought for what you have now.
Yes, but the problem is that nowadays fighting for human rights, for democracy, for human dignity doesn't sound sexy anymore.
Oh.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, strength, virility, masculinity is now on the side of what is considered as sexy among, of course not all, but part of electors and many young people. So how do you switch again? You know, I'm open for any kind of suggestion. Also to ask the help of specialists or marketing agencies, you know? How do you make these values sexy again? Because we are at the point where we must be open for any kind of suggestion. It is difficult because it can sound like a propaganda. So how do you use part of the tools of the adversary, but without sacrificing the truth?
Well, I have to say, for example, reading between young people was not sexy a few years ago, but now it's sexy because people, as the statistics say, that people who read more nowadays, it's the young people here in Spain.
Okay.
Maybe we have to say thanks to the influencers, I don't know. But now, so the change is possible. I mean,
Yes.
you can make democracy sexy.
Maybe we also, the fiction can also help, of course. You know, instead of doing a Netflix series about narcos, yeah, and making narcos sexy, you know, do a Netflix series about, yeah, the fighters for democracy and make them sexy. You know, this is what we need today.
Maybe, you know, you can call Netflix and make the suggestion. In your latest book, you speak about what Europe is. You said that before, and I am curious why you choose Christianity, capitalism, and freedom as the main pillars of this narrative.
Yeah. So first, I try not to impose, of course, a European identity by writing this book, but trying to give the reader the opportunity to find identity markers in this history. The book is 500 pages big, which is not very big because it's European history since antiquity, but still the reader can, you know, has a choice to find the identity markers. So it's not exhaustive, but it's also not the purpose of the book. The main difficulty, of course, is to articulate this abundance of data about Europe since antiquity. And so I thought, so how, maybe if I take the classic frame, which is religion, economics, and politics, that might work. And it happens that Europe has, you know, is the ground for Christianity, capitalism, and the third, I long hesitated between democracy and freedom, but as a matter of fact, democracy only covers a few centuries of Europe, so I chose freedom because I think it's the ideal that that it is under the political history, the political evolution of Europe, and that Europe was the stage of many movements, popular movements, who managed to break free with economic and political and social oppressive structure. Capitalism, of course, I mean, it's our economic system. It's very present in our lives. It's not only an economic system, it's our culture. If people don't understand the economic system where they live in, then we have also a democratic problem. Because, you know, how can they make the right decisions when they go and vote? How can they identify which program will help them in their everyday life for work and to have a good material life? And how can you, and that's the most important, how can you change capitalism if you don't understand what it is? Unfortunately, it's often the case that people want to change capitalism, but they don't even understand what it's about because it's very complex and it has changed a lot in the last centuries. So by unwrapping the history of capitalism, going back to the sources, it is a way to make it accessible, I think, for most people, to also see the good sides of it, because capitalism, you know, managed to save many people from poverty in Europe, but also in the world, and to try to correct its excesses, because we're not going to find a new system tomorrow. So first, we should try to correct the excesses by understanding what it's about. And well, and Christianism. Christianism is very important in my book. I mean, it's 1/3 of my book, because I live in Berlin, in Germany, but I also come from France, and I've always wondered why in France there was such ignorance of our religious roots. In Germany, you have, for example, you can choose religious Unterricht, you can religion as a program in schools, which I found very important, because Christianism has shaped our mentalities, our institutions, our practices, our conscience, our values, especially the values we need today. It did influence humanism in the 16th, 15th, 16th century. It did influence the idea of human rights, also enlightenment. And so we need, in order to understand ourselves better, we need to understand how much Christianism has shaped us until today, but also to understand what makes us so different in Europe. Because if we don't understand the difference between Lutheranism, Germany, Calvinism, Netherlands, Catholicism, Spain, and Orthodoxy, we will never understand each other. Because it is still, when we say of a country that it has particularities, I don't know, like the Dutch, they are good at business. It is very often linked also to their religion. So religion is still a very important indicator, a very important clue to understand the differences between us all in Europe in our relationship to authority, to work, to money, to art, to state, to democracy. And then, of course, but that I think came after, because my book was published before the election of Trump. But now that Trump is elected, and now that I see how much religion is coming back on the political scene, and how much Christianism is being instrumentalized, I think we should definitely invest this field. So not to leave the powerful messages of Christianism in the wrong hands. Because we can see how much even Trump, who is probably not religious at all, but how he manages to mobilize with these messages, instrumentalizing these messages, and how much we are actually losing ground, despite the fact that we actually are sharing many of these Christian messages. If you are a believer or not, you know, the idea that people were all created equal. You can, of course, leave the term created by side. Universalism, humanism, charity, compassion, empathy, you know, these are all Christian values which have been betrayed horribly during history, but still we have to reconnect with that in order to fight the enemies of democracies. The Christianism is not only instrumentalized in the United States, it's also very much present in France. I don't know in Spain, I haven't followed. But in France, we have billionaires. One which is very important is Bolloré. He owns many medias in France, important medias, mainstream medias, and he's very close to the far right and presents himself as very Christian. And he also instrumentalizes religion.
Mm-hmm. There was a school, it doesn't exist anymore, in which the best student was the one who made the best questions, not the ones who knew better the lesson. I mean, of course, if you have good questions, it's because you know a lot this lesson. So I don't know if you are saying that we have to know all this, we have to know about our roots, about religion, Christianity, because if not, we cannot understand ourselves. But I don't know if you are saying also that we have to know in order to change something?
Pardon?
We have to know in order to change something? Do you think that we need to change something?
Of course. What do you, sorry, what do you mean? What?
That, for example, we need to know where we came from,
yes.
That what we share, okay. But we need to know in order to maintain like it is now, or in order to make a revolution. I mean, not a revolution, but in order to change something.
No, I think I mean, you know, the future is very unclear, very vague, a bit dark. The present is a big confusion, a big mess. So what do we have left? The past. There you can still get keys, markers to navigate in the present. You know, so it is not about learning, it's not about knowledge, it's really about tools to navigate in the present. You know, to come back to the Christian values, for example, why is the EU against the death penalty? This also comes from Christianity. So I think it's important to know, because as the Pope recently said, in the United States there are people who are against abortion, but for death penalty. Mm-hmm. It's not logical, you know? So it is a tool, an argument tool also, in order to keep these markers for yourself, so not to get lost, but also to help others not to get lost and to have arguments.
Mm-hmm. Also, what do you think about the role of educational institutions in order to, in some way, transmitting this new memory, new narrative, the shared roots?
I mentioned before that in German schools you have this program, which is either you can choose between religion or ethics.
Yes.
So I think we should have in the schools maybe something like ethics inspired by our philosophical and religious history, mixed with some really concrete practice. For example, in the Netherlands, my niece, my sister lives in the Netherlands, and at school, my niece has regularly, they choose in the class, for example, they choose what kind of activities they will do, or even intern rules. They divide the class in groups. Each group has a delegate, and the delegate has to present its position, the position of the group in front of the class, with arguments, and then they vote, and sometimes they try to find a kind of compromise. This is very good democratic practice. We should also maybe try to apply this to companies, you know, having more democratic practices in companies. I think this is probably, and also on the local level, in the villages, in the little towns, you know, really to try to get to involve people in the decision process, to learn, because it's very difficult to argue, you know, the exercise of argumenting, of defending your position, of finding a compromise. So we need to practice it on very little levels in order to have citizens able then to practice it on a national level.
I think that now maybe we can open to the public. So, si teniu alguna pregunta o voleu dir la
questions, you would like to express your opinion about one of the topics we talked about, please do so. Raise your hand and we'll bring a roving microphone to you.
I wanted to ask you if you don't think that with your speech you are being a little bit discriminatory with migrant people, as when you are speaking about European identity, you are just highlighting those facts that unite us from history. I think that, don't you think that also migrant people that live in Europe also should take part on this identity? Thank you.
Can you repeat the question, maybe?
Sorry.
Or can you tell us in Catalan, maybe, and they translate? If you feel more comfortable in Catalan, o en español, o en castellano, lo que quieras. Lo que te sientas más cómoda hablando, ya lo traduciremos.
O sea, quería preguntar si...
To know if you, with your presentation, don't you think you're being a bit discriminatory with migrants? Because when you talk about the issues that connect us, you simply talked about historical considerations centuries ago, but you're not including the people that currently live in Europe or who live in Europe that come from other countries that represent the 6% of the European population. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very important question, and it's probably something that I thought about a lot by writing this book. The thing is that even if there are many inhabitants in Europe who were not born in Europe, or which parents or grandparents were not born in Europe, there is still a frame. They live in a frame. And this frame is the result of this history, including also Christian or Judeo-Christian influence. I mentioned earlier the death penalty, which is, I mean, to be against the death penalty is one condition to get into the European Union, for example, you know? And this is something that migrants, when they live in Europe, they live in this context. So I'm not talking, it's not the story of Europeans. I don't name who is European or who is not European. I try to write a story of Europe. And whoever comes to Europe, you know, lives in this frame. Then, of course, I also mention in my book the influence of Islam, and how much also positive influence it had on European knowledge. And we must not forget that part of Europe, Southeast Europe, was under Ottoman rule for centuries. So it is also part of the book. And of course, Judaism. You know, the first part, when I say Christianity, half of, I mean, or 1/3 of the part about Christianity is about Judaism, because Christianism comes from Jesus, who was Jewish. And even if Jesus didn't want a new religion, it became a new religion, but the idea at the beginning was to reform Judaism.
All right. Is it on? Yes. Is it on? Okay. So I will ask in English if that's okay.
Yes.
So I would like to pick up on one of the first questions you made about the importance of the youth opinion, especially when we talk about our future, actually. And because I'm also, well, because I grew up in Germany, I would like, so the German school system, for example, we talk about the Holocaust and the Second World War like 6 times, and to a point that we also almost get tired. And even though we talk about it so much, it's interesting to see now that the right-wing extremist party is growing, especially because of the votes of young people, and that maybe there's a lack of communication between the generations, because you talked about newspapers, that we're not reading newspapers, etc. While I also don't see young people talking at those conferences and talking about our frustration we're also feeling, and maybe how we can work on that, like the generation that we can learn from elderly people or from the older generation, and that also maybe people would listen to us and our wishes and frustration that we are feeling.
There are many questions. I would be interested in hearing, why young people feel frustrated, because we don't have, as you said, it's very rare that there are young people at these kind of conferences in general. So that's why I was very interested by meeting these young people in Slovenia, talking about Ready to Fight for Democracy, because for me it was new, this idea that democracy doesn't mobilize. You read articles about it or statistics, but when you hear it from young people, it gives a... And there I realized that there is a generational shift. So learning from older people, I don't know. What I think is that maybe it is important for young people to understand if who control the past controls the present. When you see Putin trying to change history in order to justify his aggression wars, so how much it is important, history is important in order to protect your freedom, in order to protect your freedom to choose your identity. Otherwise, others will, if the past is like a white sheet of paper, others will fill this sheet of paper, and this will have a big influence about the definition of your identity, which will be imposed on you. So if, that's what I say when I meet young people, if you want to be able to choose your identity, don't leave somebody else write the past for you, because it is very much linked. And I think this is the consciousness of the power of history and of memory is still, I think, too weak among young people, and it is also too weak among older people, and especially maybe in the school programs and school system. History is always considered as like culture, it's something we push aside. It's something accessory. But no, it is actually crucial, because it is exactly what we are experiencing today is a Kulturkampf, which is a cultural battle about identity. So it is the core of the battle between democratic and anti-democratic parties. And one very crucial tool is historical revisionism. The far-right party in Germany, AfD, they mobilize a lot of energy to call for a change of memory culture in Germany, a change, 160 degrees change. 160 degrees, okay, that means the contrary, you know, saying that it's a memory of shame, no, memory that spreads shame, that makes people feel guilty. This is also why I said in my keynote, we should be very careful not conveying this memory by giving a sense of guilt, because otherwise this might be very discouraging. But the AfD in Germany, it's one way how they also attract people is to discredit this memory culture. And in Germany, this is very powerful because the democracy in Germany is based on this remembrance work. So if you fight against one, you actually fight also against the other. If you destroy the remembrance work, you destroy the democracy. And that's exactly what the AfD wants. Besides that, we should always think, why do these political parties fight against memory work? Because memory work makes people more clever, no? And they make them more vigilant against these parties.
Hola, buenas. Voy a hacer la pregunta en castellano porque
Como quieras.
In Spanish terminology, it's a bit complicated. I wanted to thank you for the brief conference that you have given, because I think that you have spoken about these questions, which are basically the question of national identity and European identity, and whether there is a supranational identity relating all of us, because this is based on essentialist myths with primordial discourse, medieval regimes, and it makes us have a huge feeling of belonging. Therefore, the question I have is whether you can build conscience in Europe, taking into account the colonial footprint, and also if we want to use some discourse tools used by the right. On the one hand, we are introducing the right on the political discourse, and also we are falling into the displacement of the ideological axis created by the radical right. And now we provide more validity to it. I think, without going too deep into this, I think that the democratic historic memory is united to the historical responsibility, such as the Holocaust or the Spanish Civil War, but also colonial memory. And I think that we have to try to think about the Europe with democratic references and to recognize what we think, because we are privileged people being here in a Congress. Not everybody can access these spaces of cultural dissemination, and I think it will be a bit classist. I think that our discourse should reach the working classes, and this is the great discrepancy that I want to tell you about from respect. I think that capitalism and freedom are not possible, because honestly, without social justice, there is no freedom. And there is no economic freedom, and without this freedom, we cannot have nothing like this, because in these regions, what is happening is precisely this: liberalism, a democratic liberalism. So we don't have one fundamental part of democracy. Because we have elections, procedures, but the content has changed radically. So there are many themes to take into account. No, it's nice. You're expressing your discrepancy.
There were a lot of topics. I don't know if you have one specific question. Of course, I will react on the dark past of Europe. Of course, memory work is also about highlighting the dark sides of history. But I think one specificity maybe of Europe is to try to learn from that history and not trying to hide it, which you don't have everywhere in the world. We'll have to acknowledge that. So dealing with the past means, of course, trying to find guidance, and inspiration, but also, of course, warnings, and also responsibility among others. Then there were many things, but okay, of course social inequalities. Of course this is if we want to improve our democracies, but that's what I actually was saying by saying that if we understand our economic system, you know, capitalism is very flexible, very flexible. You can mix it. You see in the Scandinavian countries, these are capitalist countries, with much less social inequalities, and then you have capitalism in China, and you had capitalism in Chile under Pinochet. So just maybe don't throw the baby with I mean, everything, le bébé avec l'eau du bain, but we should try to see what we can keep and how we can model it in a sense which we have more social inequalities. That means, of course, more intervention of state to stop the social inequalities. And of course, social inequalities are very dangerous for a stable democracy, so they should be fought against. What else were the... Was there another question?
Yes, he has another question.
Es que,
What,
por ejemplo, yo creo que hay una
don't-
cosa que quizá no hemos podido tratar en debates de conferencias igual previas.
One of the things we have not been able to deal with in previous debates.
No, she said that if you want, she can speak in English, but she's been todo lo que dices se le está traduciendo, ya está, puedes continuar.
Everything is being translated into English, so you can choose whatever language you want. Speaking of nationalisms,
Just on that, sorry. Just this I wanted also to say something. Trying to build a feeling of common belonging in Europe doesn't mean that you erase the feeling of local belonging. It can be regional, it can be not. Because this is something nobody can erase and replace. You cannot replace the Heimat, the place where you were born, where you grew up. You have an emotional relationship with the region where you were born and where you grew up. Language, cuisine, rituals, humor, you know, perfume, landscapes. And this is very important to respect, that people need this to be anchored. Also, it gives them a sense of security. But Europe could be a kind of second Heimat, a kind of second home. A home where we try to share a common ideal. That doesn't mean that the EU is reaching this ideal now, but at least it has these ideals, which is good news because it can change. You know, the quest of truth of justice, of more equality, etc. Because I think every human being needs something bigger than his little horizon. He needs something that makes him dream and that he can share collectively. And that's, for me, the role of Europe. Yeah, sorry, you can go on.
Claro, lo que me parece que es como el tema central es
I
precisamente...
think it's central is precisely exactly what historical landmarks unite us as Europeans, and to create a democratic memory going beyond state frontiers. So I think that sometimes we interpret the memory of the Holocaust in a very simplistic way. Like Zionism. Zionism cannot be democratic because a state based on occupation is not very democratic, but sometimes we call democratic memory, for example, in Spain, communists or anarchists that were fighting for social utopias, but sometimes we create a utopian rebuilding of the past. For example, the European Union is built in a way reflecting this opposition to trauma of the Holocaust. So what? In Spain, this is what we have with amnesty. Also the European community. This has to be taken into account. And it's also manifested in religion. So I understand there is a feeling there, like a humanitarian feeling here in Spain with conference that tolerates abuses to children. It's complicated. But in the practical development, I think it's quite complicated, and we have to articulate, and sometimes it can be used this that we are thinking.
Muy bien.
Thank you.
No sé si hay...
I don't know if somebody else would like to contribute.
Yo me voy a...
I'm going to intervene in Spanish, because if I have to do it in English, it's not so easy. Please bring the microphone close to your mouth, otherwise it's impossible to hear you. Okay, thank you. That's better. Also, thank you. Secondly, I'm going to use Spanish, because otherwise I won't be able to say all I want to say. I am quite convinced that the pro-European, and it does make sense, and I share this idea of an identity based on a common past. For example, going back to the past mentioned to my colleague, I think it's possible to have several interpretations that abandon a little bit the chauvinism of my kingdom against yours, interpret in an interesting way. That makes us think that this is a way that we will share in things from an economic perspective. I think that our identity as Europeans can be based on learning. And one of the things that I like is that they were saying that we need European narration. The best one we can build is thinking about the past, thinking about what's happening in the past, and what we can do thinking about the future, and the identity about war and genocide, and also capitalism and totalitarianism. And Europe will have an opportunity going to making people participate in their policies and this world to bring people close to these European values. Yes, and this will be part of the action of Europe and the reality around it. We have spoken about Ukraine and Russia. This is something that hurt me because I love this culture and I did not imagine that this thing could happen. Europe, it's standing and looking at Ukraine, and if we really learn from our past in order to learn for our present, we could see that our attitude has been like the one of Chamberlain, looking away when Germany wanted to eat our Czech colleagues. Or, for example, here in Spain, we were entering into a debate similar to our identity and fascism and freedom, etc. In this sense, one way of European identity becoming an option, there is a genocide in Israel and Palestine. We have lived here in Europe. And even if I'm Spanish, I think that we are European. The genocide in Germany, Poland, it's also ours. And maybe one way of creating awareness would be to participate in it. And for example, a very specific voice is that we have to stop it. And then when the rise of totalitarianism happened in the US, we're seeing one. When we have seen these recent meetings going to the US, I had hope. And I don't feel that Europe is doing so. Even if I'm a convinced European, I feel like this. Finally, you were speaking about how capitalism responds to democratic values. I think that Europe is closer to socialism. We also have some examples of some of our colleagues, and I think that, or is it from Latin America? And I think that they respond to these common values. Maybe not Europe, but the ones in Spain, yes. Chile, for example, an approach to socialist democracy, but it was frustrated. So I think that there are other terrains of interest where we can find references.
Well, I'm happy to hear how much inspired you are and how inspiring you are all about these. The worst is to be indifferent. So maybe short about Ukraine. No, I think Europe has reacted a lot to Ukraine, and I think we should not forget that Germany has made a 160-degree change about his military politics. And that is probably one of the biggest shifts in Germany's politics since '89. So I think that in Brussels we have leaders who are very aware of what's going on. It's more the citizens, maybe, who are not aware enough. And that brings me to the question of the Holocaust. You know, learning from the Holocaust has two sides. The first is to learn empathy. And I think that this we did succeed quite well. Also, fiction helps us a lot to identify with the victims. What we are missing is to try to imagine that we are not the victims, but on the other side. And that, in my opinion, has been not enough conveyed in the way we transmit history. that we are all vulnerable to become these complicit of criminal ideologies and regimes, and that it is not enough to denounce, to accuse, or to be indignated. We should start to look at ourselves and to be very vigilant. Because as I said in my keynote, we are much more vulnerable than we think. I just give you an example comparing West Germany and East Germany. Both commemorated against Nazism. West Germany late, after decades of scandalous impunity, but then, I would say, starting in the 70s and then 80s, West Germany started to accept that big parts of its own society contributed to create the condition which make the Holocaust possible, contributed to build the conditions, and so identified with the persecutor or the bystanders. In East Germany, from the beginning, East Germany was founded on the myth that it was the country of those who had fought against Nazism beside the communists and the Soviet Union. That was true for part of their leaders, but that was not true for the citizens. I mean, there was not East and West Germany under the Third Reich, so that the citizens in East Germany were as Nazi as the other ones. But they did commemorate very much the end of World War II and the fight against Nazism and against fascism. They did commemorate it much more than any other country in Western Europe. But they identified with the resistance and not with the persecutor. So you can learn very different things from the same history, whether you see yourself as a potential resistant or potential persecutor. And this is the key.
Hi ha més qüestions? Seria l'última, potser perquè hauríem d'anar acabant. Endavant.
Castellano.
Sí, con lo que quieras.
Last question. From Latin America, I would like to go back to the reasoning of our previous colleague. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you the following. Going back to the same subject, if Europe as a concept or the idea of Europe is cemented on certain values, which are precisely the ones we're speaking about in this Congress. But with the response that you have given to my colleague about migration and the colonial past of Europe, I would like to ask you if you don't think that understanding, in this sense, Latin America from colonial past, if this would not mean understanding Latin America only from a Eurocentric perspective, and this would not be maybe in concordance with the democratic values presented by this concept of Europe.
My book is not a world history. You know, it's only about Europe, and of course about how Europe stole the history of other people. But it's not about the perception of the world by Europeans. This is another book. I mean, there are, in the last decades, there is this trend of global history, where historians try to tell the global history not from a European perspective. They decentralize the perspective. But this is not my work.
Bueno, està molt bé tenir tantes veus.
It's nice to listen to different critical voices and questions. I will highlight also the work done by Géraldine and what she has presented at the beginning about the individual responsibility, and also, of course, to think and show some empathy for those who suffer, but also to realize that we can provide support in an active or passive way to those who commit barbarities. And this is what we see sometimes in front of what's happening in Gaza and many other places. And going back to this responsibility, we have spoken about the Nazi Germany. I go back because a professor from the University of Barcelona, Pau Castell, was talking about this. He has done some research about the witch hunt. Catalonia was pioneer, and we killed many of them, and the main those who persecuted these witches were the neighbors. Not long ago, we remember the importance, probably, and I'm joking a little bit, the granddaughters of the perpetrators. Therefore, I think that it's nice to try to think about the responsibilities that we have and not to think about the others. And in this sense, this is what we need in order to try to have democracy. Thank you.